Hello friends, welcome to the world of industrial safety management. Today we are going to have discourse 6, which is part 2 of the 5 parts of hazard identification, risk assessment and risk management. In last discourse we looked into hazard identification. Now in this discourse 6 we will look into risk assessment. We will try to understand its meanings and steps. Very importantly, risk assessment is a very important and crucial step for risk management. So, if at all you want to go for the risk management, you must know hazards and you must assess the risk which is associated with that particular hazard. Now we have already learned about what is risk, but here we will have some repetition again. We will just brush up. So risk is the combination of the consequences and probability of the harm from a particular hazard if realized. See, it is very important sentence or definition. So there has to be a hazard, the hazard has to be realized, and there may be a harm if the hazard is realized. So what is the probability of that hazard being realized and what will be the consequence if it is realized? So that is risk. So risk is a product of probability and consequences. It's a product, it's not addition. So in other words, it is an expression of possible loss or a chance of a loss. So what is the possible loss and what is the chance of the loss? It is expressed as probability of accident happening. So another terminology, that it is expressed as probability of accident happening. So risk is to do with the likelihood of the harm occurring in the actual circumstances of operation. So day-to-day operations, whatever we are doing, so we just find out what is the likelihood of the harm. It is being a product. It increases if either of the probability or consequences increase. So if probability is more, the risk will be more. If the consequence is more, the risk will be more. It's just a pure mathematics. Now just with a small example or anecdote, we will try to understand a complete safety story along with the risk. Let us consider that you are traveling from Nasik to Mumbai via bus. You have boarded a bus. Now, after you have boarded, some passenger comes, enter the bus, and he puts his heavy hard bag onto the rack above your head. Now try to understand. Bus is a moving object and there is a chance that the hard bag may fall down because of the vibration or the turns the bus takes. So in short, that person has created an unsafe condition. Now bus start moving. Now road up to Kasara Ghat is that way normal. There are no twists and turns more, or it is not bumpy. So in all probability that that bag may not fall down. So the probability is less. But as soon as the bus enter Kasara Ghat and it start taking twists and turns, the probability of that bag falling down increases. Right? So by chance you cross the Kasara Ghat, again you come onto the smooth road, but that bag has not fallen down. But if that bag would have been fallen down in the ghat, we can say the incidence has taken place. Now there are two possibilities. One, that the bag falls down in the azal, so nobody is harmed, so it is a near miss. And if it falls on your head or somebody else's head, probably you or the other person will be injured, so that we can call it as accident. So there is a consequence that there is a head injury or shoulder injury, and it will depend on the impact which you receive. If the impact is more, if the bag is very heavy, then the injury will be more, so the consequence will increase. So what happens is that, consider that the bag has fallen down in the azal. You request the passenger that how it is unsafe to keep the bag on the rack, and you ask him or request him to keep it at the back side, at back end of the bus. So this is, you can consider as a corrective action or training of that person, that you are not supposed to keep the bag on the rack when it is a hard bag and a heavy bag. So you can consider it as corrective action as well as some training. Now if that person do not listen, then you complain to the conductor. Conductor asks him to keep the bag at the back. He says that there is a rule that you cannot keep such heavy bags, big bags in the rack. Still he does not try to listen. So what will happen? The conductor will say that either you keep the bag at the back, or I will stop the bus and I will deboard you. So ultimately, because of that pressure, because of the rule he has shown, the person agrees and keeps the bag at the back. So this is all legal compliance. So there are certain laws and legal consequences, and so you do the corrective action. So from this short anecdote, we have learned everything: what is hazard, what is unsafe condition, what is risk, what is near miss, what is accident, what is training and corrective action, and what is the legal action. I think you have come to know, or you must have understood all the concepts in a very clear manner through this anecdote. Now let us come to some important definitions. First is impact or consequence. So it is a harm or damage to the people, environment, equipment or property. Whatever the harm or damage is done. Probability, we have seen, it is likelihood or chance of the occurrence. It's a mathematical definition. Severity means degree of harm expected from an impact. Means what is the level of the harm or degree of the harm, whether it is a minor injury or major injury, or whether it is the damage to the property is low or high. So you define the severity, that degree of harm expected from an impact. Now risk rating, it's a numerical value to quantify the significance or level of a particular risk. Now try to understand, we just can't express the risk in a proper manner if you just say low risk, medium risk, high risk. These are open-ended terms. So ultimately you have to bring down that risk level on a numerical value. So that is called as risk rating. We will look into the risk rating in the next discourse. So you can compare 2 and 5, 5 and 10, isn't it? But you just can't have the idea what is the difference between low and high. Now, significant risk. A risk that because of its nature or degree warrants priority attention, means the risk is more. It's so significant that you have to attend the risk immediately without wasting any time. So such risks are called as the significant risk or the major risk or sometimes critical risks. Now, what is risk management? Application of policies, practices and resources that minimizes risk and impact. We will go into the detail what is risk management and how it is implemented in coming discourses. Now, let us try to understand what is risk assessment. Now, risk assessment is an important step in protecting your workers and your business. So, it is one of the steps. You take many steps out of that. It is one of the important steps for what? To protect your workers and your business, and at the same time you are going to comply with the law, because there are certain laws which you are supposed to comply. Say Factory Act, it is one of the important act about the safety in the manufacturing places, and so you have to comply the Factory Act. Now, this risk assessment help you to focus on the risks that really matter in your workplace. So every workplace has got its own hazards, has got its own risks and risk factors. So you focus on to the risks which matter in your workplace. The ones which have the potential to cause real harm. Now, very importantly and logically, the law, say Factory Act or the Factory Law, does not expect you to eliminate all the risk. We have seen that either you have to eliminate the risk, eliminate the hazard, or minimize it. So it is not a compulsion by the law that every risk has to be eliminated. Practically it is not possible. But you are required to protect people as far as possible, reasonably practicable. This reasonably practicable word is used in the Factory Act itself. So whatever you take the corrective action, they have to be reasonably practicable. That means it not be unnecessarily having very high cost or excessive control, which is not required, right? So if a machine is creating a noise up to the decibel of say 90 or 100, then you can use the ear protection devices or PPE. There is no need to create the enclosure. But if the noise level is 120, 125, then it becomes practicable to have an enclosure to the machine, so that, or enclosure to that area, so that the noise is reduced. Other people are not suffered or harmed. Now, workers and others have a right to be protected from harm caused by a failure to take reasonable control measures. So, management is supposed to take reasonable control measures to control and minimize the risk, and this is the right of the workers. See, as per the Factory Act, workers can refuse to work in a condition when there is an imminent danger. It is given in Factory Act that it is a right of the workers to refuse. that they can't work in such conditions. It is scrutiny of activities or processes. What is risk assessment? We scrutinize the activity or processes, and which include plant, machinery, materials, different types of energy and people. In last discourse, when we looked into the hazard identification, we have looked into a lot of details how you look into plant, materials and so on. Here we identify the probabilities of EHS adverse events. So what is the probability of an adverse event by which it results in injury, illness, harm to the environment, and we evaluate what will be the potential consequences, what will be the level of the consequence, what will be the consequence and what will be the potential consequence, and what is the level of the consequence. Now, understanding the level of the risk is a very important part of the assessment. So, by just knowing the risk, yes, there is a hazard and there is a risk. Only knowing that is not enough. We have to find out the level of the risk, whether it is a very negligible risk or residual risk, whether it is a minor risk, major risk or a critical risk, and you have to express it in numerical form by doing the risk rating. So risk assessment is simply a careful examination of what in your work could cause harm to people. So you examine thoroughly that while doing the work, what can cause the harm to the people. By that you can weigh up whether you have taken enough precautions or should do more to prevent harm. So there may be some precautions taken. See, take the case of a machine. Machinery manufacturer has provided certain guarding. So some precaution is taken. But sometimes it happens that after installing the machine, you feel that some additional guarding is required or some different type of guarding is required to prevent the harm. So you do that. So the assessment must consider whether the current controls are adequate. So if there is a guard, you feel that it is not adequate, but probably you might have the interlocking guard. That will be better. So what you do, you judge the things against the standard and try to resolve, try to bring in the additional controls. So if they are not, means if the present controls are not enough, then you should determine the assessment, risk assessment should determine in what way they should be improved. I gave the example that if there is a fixed guard, you feel like there is a need of the flexible guard, or you need interlocking arrangement and so on. So in all this context, control means any action taken to eliminate or reduce the risk. So basically it is an assessment whether the controls which are established, whether the controls are established or there are no controls. If the controls are established, whether they are sufficient. If they are not sufficient, you are supposed to create more controls so that the risk is either eliminated or minimized. Now we have defined accident, and you know that accidents and ill health can ruin lives and affect your business too, because if the output is lost, if the machinery is damaged, there are exorbitant insurance costs, and sometimes you may have to go to the court. So you are supposed to legally required to assess the risk. So again, there is a legal binding. So when we say that you have to establish the control reasonably practicable, so it is understood that you have to assess the controls established and you have to assess the risk involved. It is implied in that. So you are legally required to assess the risk in your workplace so that you put in place a plan to control the risks. So in short, what is to be done? Stop adverse events before they happen. Means stop hazards before they cause harm. Now, if you have listed the hazards, you have created the inventory of the hazard, then sort out which hazard there is a likelihood to lead to serious harm and which hazard may result in minor injuries. So, minor risk, major risk, like that, or a critical risk. Now, act on that. So, act to control the risk. That control to be established should be in a sensible order. That means you have to first look into the critical risk, then major risk, then minor risk. And that has to be done in a time frame. It cannot be open-ended affair. You must clearly put a time frame that within 8 days, within 3 days, within 15 days, the corrective action will be taken. Now, try to understand the difference between hazard identification and risk assessment. Both of them are not same. Only identifying hazard is not enough. You have to go further. On the next step, you have to do the risk assessment. So from an example of circular saw, we will try to understand the difference. Now you know the circular saw is a hazardous machine because its blade is capable of severing your arm or your finger just as readily as a piece of timber. The way it cuts the timber, with the same ease it can cut your finger or hand. So there is a hazard. So we have identified hazard that you are working on a circular saw and that operation is hazardous. But what is the risk? The risk is a more complex concept and it depends on many factors. What are those factors? In this case, the training and skill of the operator. The operator must be trained to work on the circular saw. So he must know everything about the circular saw, the machine. He must know how to operate it. He must know what precautions are to be taken. He must know which PPE is to be worn. So he should have all the trainings and he should have the skill which comes by the experience if he is working on it for a longer period. So whether the worker is trained or skilled, risk depends on that. The correct use of guards. So there are, adjustable guards on the top of the circular saw. So he has to see whether the guards are properly fit on the machine. So if the guards are properly fit, it is okay. If the guards are not properly fit and they are not self-adjustable, then there is a problem. Then he can use the safety devices such as push sticks. Push sticks are those, they are specially shaped piece of wood for pushing the timber to the sawn past the blade. So you don't bring your hands or fingers near to the blade, but you push the wood to be sawn with the help of the push stick. Then there is a question of general housekeeping, whether the things are litter around. He has to be is standing in a very awkward position because of the things around. There is the lighting, the temperature in the vicinity of the machine. So these are the environmental factors which also add to the ease or cumbersomeness of the operation the worker is doing on the circular saw. So logically and obviously, if the operator is not trained, if he does not have that skill, if the correct guards and devices are not used, if general work condition, especially lighting, is poor, then the possibility of accident is more, and in turn risk is more, and vice versa. That means if the operator is trained, if the guards are correct, if the working conditions are good, then the risk is less. So hazard is same, but the level of risk is different depending on the different factors. I think now you can understand what is the difference between hazard identification and risk assessment. So it follows from the above example that hazard identification is usually much easier than risk assessment. Hazard identification is basically no more than recognizing the potential for injuries and loss. We discussed it. This can often be done by simply coupling observation with common sense. When we looked into hazard identification, we have learned that you have to observe with your eyes, you have to use your sensory organs, and you have to use your skill, your experience, your common sense to identify the hazard. But risk assessment involves far more difficult value judgment based on various factors. We have understood it with the example. Now, who are to be involved in risk assessment? If your organization is small, there are very few people working, you yourself can do the hazard identification and risk assessment. You need not have to have some health and safety expert. But if you work in a large organization, you could ask your health and safety advisor to help you. If you yourself are not confident, don't find yourself capable of doing this risk assessment, get the help from someone who is competent. So in all cases, you should make sure that you involve your staff or their representative in the process. It is a must. The safety representative or the departmental representative or the staff involved in that particular area, because as they are working there, they are more aware about their situations, the conditions. They will have useful information about how the work is done that will make your assessment of the risk more thorough and effective. So take help of the people. There is no harm in taking the help of the people. In safety, you have to involve all the people. Now, what are the 5 steps to assess the risk? The step 1 is identify the hazard. Now, we have thoroughly looked into identification of the hazards. So, we will skip this step 1. You can read through the slide. Now again, decide who might be harmed and how. In risk or the hazard identification, we have looked into how you have to ask the question who, what, when, where, how. So think who might be harmed, whether one individual will be harmed or a group of the people will be harmed. So what will be the extent of the harm? What will be the extent of the consequence? What type of injury will be there or ill health will be there, and so on. Now evaluate the risk, means do the risk rating. We will look into the risk rating in the next discourse. So evaluate the risk, whether it is minor, major or critical, or what is the numerical value of the risk. Then see what you are doing already, what controls are there, how the work is organized. Now compare this with the good practice. There are always good practices. You call it as GMP. So see what are the standards, what are the good practices, compare your conditions or your assessment with that, and see if there is something more you should be doing to bring yourself up to that standard. When you are asking yourself all these questions, whether the your controls are okay, whether they are up to the standard, at the same time you have to think and consider that, can I get rid of the hazard altogether? That means whether I will be able to eliminate the hazard. We have repeatedly seen this, that the first priority is the elimination of the hazard. If not, minimize. So how can I control the risk so that the risk is at a very residual level and the harm is unlikely? Use the principle of hierarchy of control, that is eliminate, substitute, engineering control, administrative control and the PPE. We will look into the hierarchy of control at the appropriate time. Involve your staff so that you can be sure that what you propose to do will work in practice and won't introduce any new hazard. So consultation is very, very important before taking the final decision. So apply the following principles, if possible in the following order. So when you are choosing certain option to increase the control, so try a less risky option. So switch to using a less hazardous chemical. Instead of benzene, you can use toluene. So that is the substitution. Now prevent access to the hazard. So you prevent people by going near the hazard. So guarding of the machine. So what we are doing, by guarding you are preventing the access. Organize work to reduce exposure to the hazard. That means there are gangways or the walkways or pedestrian ways. So outside the factory the traffic is moving on. So you create the barrier between the traffic and the pedestrian. You mark a lane for the pedestrian so that pedestrians are supposed to walk through the lane on the footpath you are marked. Use of personal protective equipment. Issue the proper required mandatory PPE to the people. Provide welfare facilities such as washing facility, first aid facility, removal of contamination and so on. Improving health and safety need not cost a lot. It's a misnomer or a wrong belief that if you do something for safety, there is a cost involved. It is always the case that the cost which is there to minimize the risk is always very less than the expenses you incur when the accident takes place. It is not even 1/5 of that, a general statistic. So don't say that the safety or the safety measures cost a lot. Many a times very simple measures, very small measures, cheap measures can work wonders. So for instance, placing a mirror on a dangerous blind corner. So if the road is turning in 90 degree, what you do that you put the mirrors. So by mirror, the approaching motorist can see the vehicle which is coming from his left side or the right side. But failure to take simple precautions can cost you a lot more if an accident does happen. I told you that always the expenses incurred on the safety measures is always less than the the cost involved and the expenses incurred when the accident takes place. Now step 4, record your finding. So you have recorded the hazard, now you have recorded or assessed the risk, you have numerically rated the risk. Then next step is you have to find out what is the corrective action and preventive action. So putting the results of your risk assessment into practice, that is important. You have to bring it into the practice. Will make a difference when looking after people and your business. Now a good plan of action often includes a mixture of different things. What are they? A few cheap or easy improvement that can be done quickly, perhaps as a temporary solution. So you create a temporary solution, but until more reliable controls are in place. You just cannot continue with the temporary solution. You have to establish the reliable controls afterwards in a particular time frame. Now long-term solutions are required for those risks which are most likely to cause accident or ill health, and they have the worst potential consequences. So long-term solutions are required there. Short-term or temporary solutions cannot suffice where the risk is more, whether the potential consequence is more. Here the training of the employees is very, very important. That how the main risks are to be assessed and how they are to be controlled. So people are to be trained in hazard identification, risk assessment, and creating the controls. Then you have to make regular checks to make sure that the control measures stay in place. That means if you have put a guard on the machine, it may happen that a maintenance person while doing the maintenance may remove the guard, and after his work is over he will not replace the guard. So the guard must remain in its place all the time. And decide that who will lead the action, that means who will take the corrective action and in what time frame it will take the corrective action. Now step 5 is review and update if necessary. So periodically, after every 6 months or after every year, formally review where you are, to make sure that you are still improving. That means you have to keep on improving, or not improving, at least see that you are not sliding back. Means you are not deteriorating on the subject matter. So look at your risk assessment again, whether you have done a risk assessment thoroughly 1 year back. So after 1 year, you again look into the risk assessment thoroughly, and you find out have there been any changes? So whether there are changes in the process, changes in the raw material, changes in the machine, or there is improvement in the machine, new machine has come. So whenever there is a change, and whenever you do the improvements, you have to see whether the change is not creating any new hazard and the improvement is giving you the results. And is there any need to improve further? Whether your workers have spotted a new problem, you have to review. Now, you are supposed to learn from accidents or near misses. So while doing this risk assessment, you have to go through the accidents and near misses and see whether you have learned from it and whether you have established the required controls so that the accident or the near miss does not occur again. You have to stop the occurrence. So you have to make sure your risk assessment stays up to date. Now, if in the year there is a significant change, don't wait. Means do not wait. If there is a big change, maybe in the machine or maybe a new machine, so need not wait at the year end and then you will do the assessment. Do the risk assessment immediately, wherever necessary, wherever such situation arises, and immediately amend it. So friends, in this discourse, we have tried to understand what is the risk assessment, what is the difference between hazard identification and risk assessment, why there is a need of risk assessment, and what are the 5 steps in doing the risk assessment. So I thank you very much for watching. I request you to resume viewing further by switching on to discourse 7, where we will be looking into the second part of risk assessment, which is risk rating methodology. Friends, do not forget to like, share, comment and subscribing to the channel. Once again, thank you very much.